My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our 8th edition of Transatlantic Tuesday, this time focused on globalization and the 2020 election. Before I pass it on to my colleague Peter Chase, who's a senior fellow in our Brussels office and also an expert on trade, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for support of this event, and also just run through the game plan with all of you that are logged on for today's session. We'll have a conversation with our experts, Heather Boushey and the Honorable Matthias Berninger, for a few minutes, about 20 minutes or so, and then Peter will open it up to questions. And for all of you that are interested in posing a question, please use the raise your hand function, and Peter will call on you. The questions will automatically queue up, so feel free to start posting your questions already, and he'll call on you to unmute and introduce yourself. Please bear in mind that this session is being recorded, or read out the question, whatever you prefer. So with that, I'd like to now hand the baton over to Peter. Thank you again for logging on. Peter, you have to unmute yourself. I do that all the time.
Well, you would think that I'd know a little bit better by now. Anyway, welcome to everyone. Thank you very much, Suda, for setting this up. This Transatlantic Tuesday is a way to talk to Europeans and Americans about how major trends are affecting the United States and Europe. And this time focusing very much on the impact of globalization and the US election. Globalization in American society, there's a sense that globalization, whether it's through trade or through migration or through cultural exchanges, can be something that's difficult, that can be bad. There's many discussions about it being a force behind the election of Mr. Trump, a force behind some of the discussions in Europe.
Dog is throwing up in here.
And as a result, it's something that I think is really important for us to be looking at when we're looking at the US elections and the relationship between the United States changes, societal changes, both in the United States and Europe. And with that, we have two people who will have very different, maybe possibly different, but hopefully views that will get us all really interested in and thinking about this impact of globalization and the polities of the United States as we go to the elections. Heather Boushey is the CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, a think tank that focuses on inequality and growth, the causes of inequality, its impact on growth. And Matthias Berninger is a former German politician with the Green Party who has worked for a long time in the United States for American and German corporations, is currently with Bayer. So with that, what I'd like to do, Heather, if I may, is go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of set the stage as you see it. Then Matthias, to ask you to go ahead and comment. And then let's get into an interactive conversation. As soon as people start asking questions, I'd like to see if we can bring people in, because it's always much more fun if the people who are in the audience are also engaging with you. And I know that the reason they came is in part to engage with you. So with that, Heather, I'll turn it to you.
Wonderful. It's great to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I agree, it's most fun when people ask questions, so I really encourage everybody to engage. So the topic of globalization and the US elections is, it's been a perennial one for not just this election, but the one 4 years ago and ones before that. I start by thinking about this question in terms of what the economy means for US workers and their families. And one of the things we know is that over the past few decades, we've seen an economy that has been characterized by rising economic inequality across jobs, across incomes, across regions of the United States, across wealth, alongside rising economic concentration across firms. So these economic trends, the availability of jobs, the quality and quantity of those jobs really provide the context for how Americans think about the politics of globalization and the politics of trade policy and our place in the world in terms of our economic place in the world. And I think that, we know that US workers and their families are very much concerned about being able to find a good job, being able to support their families. The crisis over the past year, over 2020 in terms of the coronavirus has really elevated a series of questions with respect to globalization around global supply chains. The United States seemed to be uniquely incapable of meeting the need of protective gear, for example, for folks in essential industries or even in hospitals due to the nature of our supply chains and the way that we hadn't thought about the potential needs that we might have. But I want to emphasize, as we think about the politics of globalization and trade in the US, starting from this place about thinking about what the economic opportunities are for workers and their families and this long-term rise of inequality, the questions aren't just around just trade and trading partners. It's around the whole basket of questions around, again, supply chains, the concentration of firms globally, what that means for the quality of jobs and the way that that businesses that operate here in the United States care or don't care about American workers and American communities. The ability of firms to pit one another in sort of a race to the bottom around tax policy, and the renewed attention we've seen on firms being able to do tax avoidance by parking their profits overseas. These are all concerns that aren't so much about trade, but about the way that we think about the rules of trade and how it affects people and families and workplaces. And starts from the understanding that our economy is embedded in these rules that we create or don't create, and that what Americans are looking for from their politicians, from their leaders, is a set of leaders that are going to prioritize what's happening in our communities and make sure that the way we fit into the global economy is actually good for workers and families. So that, I think, is the crux of the political issue. Happy to keep going, but I want to hear from Matthias. Oh, you're muted again.
Can I do a very quick follow-up? With what you said, was Donald Trump, in your view, elected in part because the American worker thought that he would address those concerns that you think people have?
So yes, I would say that trade played a huge role in the 2016 election on both sides of the aisle. One of the things that's really been interesting watching this over the past decade or so is how this issue has become has upended the traditional partisan lines of both of Republicans and Democrats in terms of how both voters and politicians think about the issue. So, Trump really tapped into this idea that because of trade deals, Americans were getting a raw deal and he was going to do something better. One of the first things he did when he came into office, right after he was inaugurated, is he got on American televisions and he talked about this factory, this carrier factory that was going to up and move to Mexico, I believe. And he said, no, we're not going to let you do that. And it was a stunning moment as an economist to hear a politician say, oh, we have control over what happens in our communities. And the economy isn't just driven by these, natural laws that we don't have any control over. Actually, we can exert some control over this. Now, I think that, where we sit now in August of 2020, his trade policies have by and large been a failure. He hasn't closed the trade deficit. He hasn't done the things that he set out to do. He hasn't seen the success that he promised the American people. But the idea that that our society could take some control over whether or not firms would leave communities and leave them hanging without jobs, that moment and that idea, I think, is something that really has motivated voters and was key in the 2016 election.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Matthias, you're a politician, so you were close to communities, and now you're working with companies. You're part of this. How would you look at this whole issue of globalization and its impact, its political impact, particularly in the United States, where you've lived now for some time, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, for a bit more than 10 years. So Peter, first of all, thanks for having me. What I observe is an accelerating trend into a bipolar world that is basically dominated by two blocks. The US is still in the game, and Russia, which was dominating a bloc when I grew up, is now replaced by China. And I thought that growing up that globalization would actually end the division of the world in such two blocks. I also believe that if we want to solve some of the big problems in the world, we have to kind of throw ourselves against tendencies to kind of split the world in two halves. And I believe that that is the key challenge, that the US needs to make up their mind whether they want to play a lead role in uniting the world or whether they want to be one of the two power centers in the world. I would say that for the most time in my life, the US was a key driver of developments, a key participant in multilateral institutions, but we are seeing that fizzling off, and that's a big challenge. When I look at the global problems, and the interesting thing about the US is you can see them en miniature in the US. Soon we will be 8 billion people. Half of them don't have good access to water. Half of them doesn't have good access to health, just to name two examples. And the question is whether we can combine globalization, exchange between countries, with solving some of these problems, including the ecological crisis, or whether we are not capable of doing that. That's for me the big question. And when it comes to the US, the question is there somewhat a majority of voters in the United States that is willing to move in that direction? Currently, I don't see it.
When you say move in that direction, you mean move in the direction of using globalization as a force to address global problems, as a positive force as opposed to a negative force?
Well, and in some ways, I mean, this has happened. So the fight against poverty in China, you can say a lot about the Chinese political system, but we have seen a large number of people living in despair rising up. Yeah? And that's the upside of what we experience in some other countries as a downside. But I think only if we take a real global view on those developments, we are able to, both on the business side as well as on the side of the political movers and shakers, to successfully address the challenges. I don't think that one world leader kind of chipping in $2 billion to the World Health Organization and the other tweeting the same organization sucks helps anybody independent.
Heather, would you like to come in on this? Because I mean, I think it's, you talked about the rules that we as citizens, whether European or American, expect everyone to live by as individuals, as companies. Matthias was talking about the international rules that we created. You've looked at the inequality that you've seen develop in the United States. And Matthias is looking at inequality that has actually decreased on a global basis. How do you square these things together? I mean, yeah.
No, it's a great question, and I'm glad that Matthias brought it up. So it's an awkward question, I think, at some point for those of us who live in the United States, but who think about the intersection between what's happening in the US economy and American politics. So on the one hand, I live in this incredibly rich country, as Matthias pointed out. There are so many around the world that don't have access to the kinds of goods and services or standard of living. On the other hand, I am very concerned about the rise of economic inequality in the United States because of the way that it is I'm both concerned about it as a standard of living issue, but I'm also concerned about it as a political issue. And with the rise of economic inequality in this country, the way that economic elites have become more likely to be the democratic elected leaders, the way that so many communities have been left behind. There's a whole literature now in political science focusing on the United States that shows this economic inequality is actually correlated with the political polarization, and that is connected to the incapacity of the US state to be able to do things like, say, deal with a pandemic, right? I'm sure that all of us here know, because we read the newspapers, that the United States has had a uniquely bad response to the coronavirus. The number of deaths and cases are far higher than other countries. And that's because in many ways we have we have so many failures of governance. So connecting the dots between how economic development happens across the United States, whether and how communities are left behind, is a very important economic, political, and social issue that for the American elections, which is the theme of this conversation, globalization in US elections, we can't just say to the American people, yeah, but you're better off than all these other poor people in other countries, even because people here understand that their standard of living has been falling for generations. Just one stat. Data on economic mobility shows that for people born in the 1940s, 90% of them, by the time they were in their 30s, out-earned their parents. For the people today who were born in the early 1980s, only about half of them are out-earning their parents. That is a remarkable shift in upward mobility in the United States, especially when you connect it to the rise of inequality over just a generation and a half. And so that frustration with the fact that globalization has not worked for the vast majority of American people is a potent political issue that isn't that doesn't connect to the global poverty question, as much as I respect that is an important issue.
But okay, Matthias, particularly to come in with your view, I mean, while you've lived in the States for a lot, I presume that you've gone back and forth and spent a lot of time still in Europe and are fairly connected to it. In Europe, there is less of a push that I see against globalization as an economic issue, that is the trade part of it, than as a social issue, for instance, through migration or something like that. So but focusing on the trade aspect of it and the economic aspect of it, there's a sense, what Heather was talking about is a little bit on, there's a failure of government to help address the inequalities that have come up. Have European governments addressed with their domestic policies, have they done a better job of addressing the impacts of international trade or the impacts of economic change in the United States, in Europe, than in the United States from what you've seen? It gets a little bit, I think, to a lot of your study, Heather, or the Washington Center study about GDP can go up, but if it's disaggregated and you look at it by class, that's where the inequalities have come in. But has government intervention worked better in Europe? And if it worked better in Europe, could it work better in the United States?
I think one example where I think Europe stands out is in the area of health. We've seen it in this pandemic. So if you have a vision of health for all, Europe is closer to it than the United States. And Peter, to give you a practical example, we work at the moment on how we can drive a more inclusive growth. How can we provide access to life-saving medicines to the people that can't afford it under the current business models? That's a key pillar of our sustainability strategy. And we have all the low and middle income countries in focus, but sadly also the United States, because there's so many people in the United States who basically lack basic access to these medicines in the same way you would lack access in a very, very poor country with a admittingly even more dysfunctional societal structure. And from that vantage point, the question is, will this be an either or an and choice in the political world in the United States? Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in recent years is it's an either or choice. It's one country first versus the rest of the world. I think that will not get us to where we need to get to. And I'm far from belittling the challenges in the United States, i.e. we are well off enough here, because it doesn't take you a long car ride to see the inequality, even if you live in one of those affluent cities, admittingly DC being one of that. And of course, even a city like DC is divided in two parts, where you have a much poorer part and a growing kind of richer part. And the people that get pushed out of the city, you can then find in what previously were like flourishing suburbs. So this country needs to work on equality in order to balance their very strong, I think, stance in innovation, with more equity. That's important, and that will stabilize the economy. I mean, if you lose a job here in the United States, you lose your healthcare most of the time. So that gives everybody, I think, a flavor of how people feel at the moment in the midst of this pandemic.
May I just add one thing to that? As I just think that it's such an important point. You know, not only do we stand alone in not guaranteeing everyone access to healthcare in the United States relative to other developed economies, but we've actually seen this rise in deaths among lower income whites, especially these what they call the deaths of despair in recent years across communities. And so that's not something that one would expect to see in a highly developed, where the United States remains one of the richest countries the world has ever seen, and yet rising death rates among subgroups is a real sign that something's gone very wrong. Alongside longstanding health inequalities here in the United States, even controlling for educational attainment, Black mothers have significantly higher rates of maternal mortality relative to white mothers. So it's not just an overlay of economics and income and education, it's also this overlay of structural racism that is so core to some of these challenges. But I think we're digressing into non-globalization topic.
But if there is a sense in the American electorate that somehow globalization is the cause of the problems that they feel, globalization in the sense of trade, so the economic side of globalization. There is also a growing awareness among many Americans that there's a social migration, cultural aspect of globalization as well, that some of them like and some don't. But on the economic side of it, if they think that it's trade that's the problem, and the real problem, if you look at Europe as an example, isn't necessarily trade, but the way the government intervenes in other areas, then the population is going to be looking for, they might look towards Donald Trump for a very tough trade policy, whereas Mr. Biden has not said anything about trade, basically. He's basically talked more about the inequality issues that you've talked about. So it does matter how you think about the cause of the problems that people are responding to.
I mean, I'll start. I think that's actually incredibly important. And the trade issue, I think, is so potent because we know now, thanks to new research and evidence that economists have been producing over the past decade, that the trade policies that we have pursued have hurt particular communities. And I think that, I mean, that's where I started this conversation. It is this interplay between the capacity of the state to act on behalf of working families and particular communities, and how people think about globalization. So if what you see is that after, that what trade means, and especially, once we opened up trading relations after 2000, changed the trading relations with China, that trade isn't something that happens to every community in the same way, but that particular communities across the United States were harder hit, right? Factories up and left and moved overseas in large part due to Chinese imports. And that damage, we didn't have any plan to contain. And when I say we, I mean policymakers didn't have any plan to contain. The policies we have in place, the trade adjustment assistance, which is a fairly small amount of money, but it presumes that you can be retrained to find a new job. But if your community has been hit hard by the plant that was the anchor for your community leaving town, then it's not like you're going to be able to find a new job necessarily in another factory in your small town unless a different business comes in. And what we saw is that in many communities that didn't happen, leaving these communities essentially devastated and without good jobs. And without a policy that sort of recognized the regional and spatial nature of this challenge. So I think that I start there because people could really see the effects in particular communities, and it was easy to draw a link to trade. Americans don't have a long history of believing that government should come and rescue them. You know, our history of social insurance programs and the social welfare state has been weaker than other countries. Where we had been ahead of other countries was in terms of progressive taxation and addressing market competition, two things that we also lost our leadership on globally around the same time that we shifted our stance on trade and economic inequality. So I think that people were looking for something to blame, and it seems easy to point to this rather than to the lack of a safety net, because that conversation is also complicated and difficult to understand exactly what you're going to do when you've already abdicated your responsibility for ensuring that the trade policies that you put in place won't disproportionately harm particular communities.
Thank you. I'd like to encourage people, if they want to engage with us, to go ahead and either raise their hand or put questions in on the chat function, whatever the case may be, because we'd be happy to have you come in. Matthias, on what Heather was just saying, you know, there's an issue with companies who are part of a network that might close a facility and then move to another place. Curiously enough, not too long ago, a lot of European companies were actually moving from Europe to the United States because US energy prices were lower. You know, it's not just that they're moving to third countries, to poor countries, but they often are going to the United States. And in fact, in the United States, we have almost $3 trillion of European foreign direct investment. So the mobile companies may leave a community, but they also come into a community. How does a company like Bayer think about its relationship to the community? When you have economic issues, economic imperatives, fiduciary responsibilities to your shareholders to do certain things, but there is an impact. What do you do about that?
Well, I think first, I worked for two globally operating companies, so I clearly have a very deep view on companies that from the start actually have been very global in their mindset. So Mars, as a chocolate company, had a global, very global approach. Boushey in the country was like very US focused. And in the Bayer case, Bayer exported colors to China without knowing the language. They agreed on sign language to differentiate the colors in the midst of the 1900s or 19th century. So there is something about a firm belief that this mindset of a company overall as a bottom line creates more wealth. And I firmly believe in this. I believe that those who advocate for protectionism won't protect many people, but they get a world that is split in two global power zones. They will get exactly that bipolar world that I grew up in, just with other actors in the game. So for me, it's not about the question whether trade is good or bad, but we need to look hard at where trade didn't work. So I give three examples. First example is on human rights. People thought with China accessing the World Trade Organization, human rights will, by definition, be addressed in the right way going forward. That, I think we can say by now, didn't happen. Second example, in creating trade relationships, you don't automatically help the environment. So the whole topic of this EU-Mercosur deal that is currently being discussed, where deforestation is a big controversy, it's pretty simple. If we don't get forest protection into this trade deal, it won't happen. So the whole topic of the environment plays a big role. And then the third example, I think, is a basic question of intellectual property rights. We have seen them being questioned over and over again. But let's look at the Corona crisis. Let's look at the pandemic. Let's look at how companies suddenly basically closed their markets for exporting of medical devices and goods at the beginning of this crisis. That's basically a world where trade is no longer paramount, but the exemption. And I've seen the detail of that, and they don't look very pretty.
You mentioned, Heather, thank you. You mentioned, Heather, about recent studies about the impacts of trade on certain communities, particularly the trade when a company leaves a community, like Carrier leaving that community in Ohio, what would its impact be? There have also been studies, Mr. Trump, or the Trump administration with some of its trade policy measures, has also done a great job of giving economists, such as yourself and your colleagues, something new to study, which is what happens when a country like the United States raises barriers to trade. So on China or on Europe or on Mexico. And the things that I've seen from the National Bureau of Economic Research and from the Federal Reserve basically have consistently shown that increasing protection in the form of tariffs is bad for welfare, and even has a distributional impact. That is, lower income people are worse affected. I'd be interested whether or not that's something that you see. And then once again, how do we tease apart the difference between trade, which happens between you and me, and it's just seen differently because we're on different sides of a border, versus government policies to help people adapt to change? Which, you know, I used to work for a Democratic senator, Bill Bradley from New Jersey, and he would not support legislation to bring in foreign textiles that was always put out by Southern American states, because he said, look, in New Jersey, we had a thriving textile industry. It all just moved down to the South. And so that was change that happened within a country. It wasn't external. So how do you tease this out?
So I think a couple of things. One is that, you know, we're starting this conversation talking about the trends of globalization and politics, but what we want to ground the conversation in for the start is, what does the economy, I mean, how can this economy serve people, communities, and families? That's the number one, that should be the number one policymaking goal for policymakers in all sorts of countries. So trade is one tool. Just there's a lot of different tools that we can use to support people and families and, you know, vibrant competitive economies and innovation. So I think when we start with that goal, it allows us to sort of understand that tariffs are just one tool in the toolbox of policymakers looking to affect trade. It's a really blunt tool. I think that we've seen the way that Trump has used it as a blunt tool that seems really, sorry, I can't really think of the right word, but he's using it indiscriminately, but it also seems very pointed at particular people or leaders or firms. So it doesn't seem grounded in any goal except getting back at somebody, rather than, well, the goal, his stated goal supposedly is to create more better jobs for people here in the United States. And so evaluating which tools he should be using to do that is what I would recommend he does. And the blunt way that he's been using tariffs has not been effective. Now, could tariffs be effective if they were more thoughtful, if they were targeted on strategic industries, things that were really important? That seems like a conversation that we need to be having. You know, and we think about issues around climate change. We know that one of the contributors to climate change is the way that we ship goods overseas, right? That is actually a climate problem. It seems important that policymakers take that into account as they're making policy, because things that are exacerbating climate change through pollution and through the use of fossil fuels are within the purview of what's going to be important for the survival of the planet and the species. So I think, as so often happens, we get stuck in our toolboxes as though the tools were our goals, when in fact we need to focus on what our true goals are and figure out all the other tools that we have at our disposal.
Well, going back to the question I posed earlier, which is, I grant that, and you also talked about the fact that globalization, when people in the United States are thinking about their politics and their elections, they think of globalization and its impact on them, or these changes and its impact on them. They don't think about the impact on humanity, as Matthias was trying to bring out, and maybe we should. So there's a part of me that says, does concern about globalization like that, in that sense, does it help a Mr. Trump or does it help a Mr. Biden? You started off by saying trade would be a major, had been an issue in elections, that it would be, that globalization should be, or could be an issue this year. But just whereas the Democratic Party seems to be a party more of the coasts, the Republican Party seems to be a party more of the interior, you would think that globalization would be something that would appeal more naturally to people on the coast, less naturally to people in the interior. So just briefly, I'll go first to you, Matthias, but I'll ask you both the questions. Does globalization help the Republicans or the Democrats? Or does concerns about globalization help the Republicans or the Democrats as a political force going into this election? And then I'd kind of like your sense of that, again, thinking, Heather, that the Democratic Party is not saying a whole hell of a lot about trade this year.
Yeah, since Brexit and the election of President Trump 4 years ago, I stopped kind of making predictions. I only do scenarios from now on. I think that in this election, one scenario we need to look at are the McCloskeys, which is this lovely couple that pointed guns at demonstrators in St. Louis. Yeah. For me, they're going to be, I think, one of those artifacts of this election. So if history is written in November, December, I think the attitude of the American people towards that couple is playing a bigger role in this election than actually trade will play. And the reason being that the Democrats will not make the mistake to pick a fight with President Trump over trade. I can't see why. Actually, I think one of the legacies of Donald Trump as a president is that he has now created a 2/3 majority in the United States amongst policymakers that would always tend to oppose trade rather than kind of advocating aggressively for it. I think you need to really look hard in Washington, D.C. to kind of find the free traders of the 80s and the 90s. I think they disappeared. No politician who's up for election will be like radically pro-trade. Yeah, that's a shift in the political system that has happened, and that won't change in the days to come. The challenge is this. Of course, trade is just a kind of a boogeyman for a lot of things. Lots of people don't lose their jobs because of China. They lose their jobs because of a massive transitioning happening in an economy. People who are working in hotels pre the corona crisis will lose their jobs because we're going to travel less and we're going to have more exchanges via tools like the one we are using right now. This is disruption that is going to happen. And to give people the impression that this disruption won't happen if we only kind of went back to like a glory past is I think quite irresponsible, and we shouldn't do it, and politicians shouldn't do it because it will fall flat sooner than they want to. So the big question will be whether post the election the US is continuing to insulate themselves or is opening up again and is willing to play on global level, on trade, but also on international environmental policy and many, many other topics. And for me, there's only one place where this conversation will happen, and that's G20. All the other institutions are either too weak or basically no longer really relevant. But the G20 will be the place where the US has to decide what role they want to play.
Okay, great. You've given me a couple of quick things that I want to come back to, but I do want, Heather, to get your sense. Is globalization as part of a political debate in the United States, is that good for Mr. Trump or is it good for the Democrats, and why?
So I think that it's a tough question, but I do think that the Trump's rhetoric is still that he is an anti-globalist and that he is going to make great deals for America. I don't think that's consistent with the evidence of the 3.5 years that he's been in office. So will it be good for him? I think I think his messaging will still resonate with some people, but I wonder if it actually will resonate in fact, and we will, I think, see in the election. I do want to agree with what Matthias said, that the number of people that are just advocating free trade at this point has shrunk, but I think that is because the consequences for places all across the United States have been so frustrating for so many people, and needing to rethink how it is that the United States engages, and that the voters are really frustrated with that. I think will continue until we found some way to revitalize parts of our economy that have not been revitalized. And again, I think that the COVID-19 crisis has only underscored this with challenges that people have seen with the with the supply chain issues that have really brought that to the forefront. But my hope is that we will start this conversation in the United States by focusing on the kinds of policies that we think are going to create good jobs, and the kind of safety nets and social insurance that families all across the United States need. And if we start there and then recognize that a key part of trade is maintaining good relationships with our allies and friends, and that we live on this planet together, that I think that we can come to a better place than where we were in the pre-Trump era. But I think that people need to see that there is a shift in thinking. And so it does need to start with addressing the incredibly high unemployment rates right now in the United States. And just one other thing on what Matthias said about the technological change issue, that certainly economies change, but it really is the job of policymakers to have some sense of how we're going to help communities adjust, how we're going to help people retrain, how we're going to make sure that there still is this opportunity. And I think that's where American policymakers have too often fallen short. And it isn't the fault of either trade or technology that American communities have fallen behind. It is the fault of policymakers that have not been able to help communities adapt. And I often look to the case of Germany, where you all in Germany have this really fantastic program where when unemployment goes up, there's this policy that allows people to stay on their job, but to have their hours cut and get a welfare benefit, an unemployment benefit, helps firms, keeps people attached. It meant that during the Great Recession, while our drops in GDP were similar, the drop in the rise in unemployment in Germany was much, much smaller than the United States. And that's like a very simple policy that we have been thinking, hey, that would be a great thing for us to do here, because it's the kind of thing that I think could help us push along a better path so that we can have a different conversation about our trade policy and global regulatory infrastructure. But we have to start with dealing with human needs first.
Okay, I'm afraid we're getting towards the end, but I really don't like that. I'd like to continue. I don't know how well we can. I did see that Mr. Stuart Wood raised his hand. I'd at least like him to have an opportunity, if he would like to come in very quickly. I've just freed you up, and then we'll basically, because I can't keep you guys too much longer, Matthias, I'd also like you to either answer quickly or just kind of have a wrap up, because what you just said, Heather, is music to my ears. I'm very, very pro-trade, and I think that the issue is not trade. I think it's been the politicians who haven't done their job. Anyway, Mr. Stuart Wood. Are you there? Okay. All right, so it was not necessary. In which case, Matthias, if you would like to, respond, I think that there's a point here that's been very important, that the United States, if we have global problems, the United States needs to respond globally. And it's hard if you're turning inward. And you were starting to talk about that, but if you wanted to make any last comments about that, and particularly in light of the Corona crisis and the elections that are coming up, please do. And then I'm afraid Sud is going to tell me that
you already kind of put some blame on the politicians. So let's talk about the business community as well. So I generally believe that if we as the business community don't do the right thing, then politicians will do the wrong thing. That's what I've experienced when I was sitting on the other side of the aisle, and I've seen it over and over again happening. So when it comes to the role of business, I think the business agenda needs to be much more geared towards inclusive growth. It can't just be kind of a purely let's conquer markets. It's really about how can we reach many more people than we would reach with our traditional thinking. And I can't think of an industry that has more to learn and to do their homeworks than the pharmaceutical industry in that regard. Secondly, I think that trade agreements in the future will contain much more social and many more environmentally related topics. I do believe that if we want to get to decarbonization, we need to make sure that there is a level playing field in the different countries. Now, what I don't want to see is Europe putting a big green wall around them and basically under the auspices of the environment, kind of clothing themselves for imports. That sort of protectionism I don't want to see. But within the G20, I do believe, and that's a bit my hope, that we will get to a place where business successfully pushes for measures in this space and doesn't block them anymore. It's also true for biodiversity. It's true for so many topics. And that for me is the big agenda shift of businesses and their trade associations. So it's not enough to complain about the loss of momentum for a freer trade agenda. It's really about doing something different to recreate that momentum that is on the business agenda in my book.
Okay, Matthias, well, thank you very much. I mean, that's a good way to end in both of our, for both of you, for this discussion. Globalization is a force. It creates a lot of change. It does have political implications. We're seeing those in the United States. There are opportunities, and it really is incumbent upon both the political elite, as you discussed them, Heather, and the corporate sector, to be contributing to helping people adapt to changes that are happening, whether within their economy or in the global economy. Anyway, I'd like to thank you once again for contributing, and I've really enjoyed it. Wonderful to meet you, and hopefully we'll see you again on another Transatlantic Tuesday somewhere down the line.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye bye.